Greetings viewer, welcome to another video on my channel. In Lit Slides, we talk about literature all the way. In this video, we're going to talk about Middle English literature after the Norman invasion. In the previous video, we talked about Middle English before the conquest. If you haven't watched, make sure you do to have a better understanding. Now without further ado, let's go to the video. As we mentioned in the previous video, in the year 1066, England was once more invaded, and this time by Normans. These people were descendants of Scandinavian adventurers who at the beginning of the 10th century seized a wide part of northern France. Their leader, William, Duke of Normandy, was also of Viking origin, although he spoke a dialect of French and grew up in Normandy. By the time Normandy was an independent political entity. At the time of the invasion, England was ruled by King Harold. The two sides fought a battle called the Battle of Hastings. It lasted all day and was exceptionally bloody even by medieval standards. When Harold was eventually killed and the English fled, the way was open for William to assume the throne of England. The immediate effect of the Norman conquest upon English literature was to remove it from the care of the aristocracy. The great aristocratic households, which were the center of cultural activity, were broken up, and the English aristocracy was either displaced or forced into service with the invaders. The Norman conquest forced English language and literary expression to be strongly influenced by the arrival of the French language and culture. For a considerable time, it even seems to have fallen into disuse as a vehicle for written English, because very little survives of English between the conquest and the year 1200. Initially, those who continued to produce literary works wrote either in Latin or in Anglo-Norman, which was the dialect of French that was spoken by the new rulers of England. But since the Normans were less preoccupied with culture than the English people, the literature in Anglo-Norman was not very distinguished and long-enduring. Latin, which had always been and continued to be the language of the international church, produced a fairly rich literature in England during this period, especially in the 12th century. But it remained essentially conservative and remote, not much dealing with the subjects that are of importance in the development of literature. As a result of the Norman conquest, Wessex lost its political and cultural importance, because of which its dialect of West Saxon lost its former stronghold, and this led to the flourishing of other Middle English dialects, as the writers were now encouraged to write in the dialects of their own region. Thus, at the end of the 12th century, English literature begins to reappear, but in a different way. One of the most striking differences between the Old English literature and that of the Middle English is its origin. While the first one seems to be uttered by a single aristocratic voice, grave and decorous, Middle English, however, is spoken by varied voices, dealing with a wide range of topics, in a great diversity of style and tones, in different genres. Originality of thought is a rare feature of this literature. In Middle English literature, a modern reader experiences little difficulty in understanding the world they are talking about. Actually, it's because the writers address themselves to a popular audience, and so they achieved greater immediacy and a greater recognizability. This change and the difference between the Middle and Old literature is most obvious in the narrative of adventure, where the idealized hero of the Old English yields place to a more sympathetic and less admirable man who not only fights and fights again, but also laughs and cries, plays games, and falls in and out of love. This kind of hero is much easier to write about and understand. Another change is that the women are now finally recognized as half of the human race, although they appear ordinary as stereotypes. The important thing is women's place in society was recognized in literature, and this reflects a changing attitude in history itself. Reading literature of the Middle English gives a modern reader an impression that the Middle Ages were a period of intellectual and social stasis, in which time was standing still, and one can sense this unchangingness in works of literature of the time. But even if to a modern reader change was something imperceptible, in the daily lives of medieval men it was all too visible. In fact, the inevitability of change for worse is one of the most instantly repetitive themes of Middle English literature. But these themes are not to be thought as another expression of a word-hating doctrine imposed by Christianity. Rather, the themes and the word-hating doctrine itself are both results of the violence of life in the Middle Ages, a violence not matched again in Western history until our own times. The fact that 8 of the 18 kings who ruled England between 1060 and 1485 died deaths of violence or deaths resulting from violent activities is characteristic of the times. Chroniclers who record these events say little of the lower orders of society, but constant warfare against enemies at home and abroad, the depredation of the powerful in supplying themselves from the poor, the fearful severity of the laws combined with the failure to enforce them against the strong, and after the middle of the 14th century, recurrent pestilence compounded by famine. All these explain why change for the worse seems to have been the unchanging expectation of medieval people. Except in its most word-hating form, Middle English literature is often permeated by a curious normality and is indeed less preoccupied with its age's violence than we are with ours. It's probably because people then never conceived of a time when violence was not a fact of life. Like said before, very little literature has survived for the first century and a half after the conquest of the island, and very little have been written. But if not written, some was still being composed. The first considerable Middle English poem to have come down to us is Layamon's Brut. It was probably written about 1205 and clearly is descended from the Old English poetic measures. It is interesting to know that it was the first poem to present the legends of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table in English poetry. The story that was to catch the imagination of so many English writers of later times. Layamon's source is largely the Norman work by the poet Wace. It is however larger than its source. The long epic poem takes its name from Britain's mythical founder, the Brutus of Troy, the legendary descendants of the Trojan hero Aeneas. Brutus' most distinguished descendant is Arthur, who, according to the legend, freed Britain from the Roman attack and defended it from the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Comparing with the Old English epic Beowulf, both Layamon and the poet of Beowulf dealt with legendary materials which they thought of as history. However, Layamon moves toward a genre that has been newly introduced to Middle English literature: romance. Romance has certain typical features. It generally concerns knights and involves a large amount of fighting as well as some miscellaneous adventures. It makes a liberal use of the improbable, usually supernatural elements. It is often, though not always, involved with romantic love. Plots generally consist of a great number of events, and the style is apt to be easy and colloquial. The great age of medieval romance had been the 12th century and early 13th century, and its chief breeding ground had been aristocratic society in France. Up until almost the last quarter of the 14th century, Middle English literature was all about religion and subjects that concerned it. And the reason was of course that the church had a virtual monopoly on literacy during the Middle Ages, and most people had learned to read and write because they had something to do with the church. Otherwise, people wouldn't reach beyond some elementary education. The other reason was that the church itself was a large producer of books and was a maintainer of libraries. So we cannot expect secular works to survive even if they had been produced. However, during the last quarter of the 14th century, Middle English literature flowered suddenly in three great poets who were writing almost at the same time. The anonymous author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who is known as the Gawain poet, William Langland, and the greatest of all, Geoffrey Chaucer. The author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight not only produced the best romance of the entire period, but also wrote some other poems: Pearl, Cleanness, and Patience. The four poems are all written in the same Northwest Midland dialect of Middle English, and they share various formal and thematic features, including that three of them are written using the alliterative meter associated with what has been called the alliterative revival. William Langland, who lived and died between 1332 to 1386, is the presumed author of a work of Middle English alliterative verse, generally known as Piers Plowman, an allegory with a complex variety of religious themes. His achievement in Piers Plowman is important both in literature and in history, and one reason for that is he faces directly the great religious and social issues of his day, which to some extent became the great issues of the following century and a half. Some say that his Piers Plowman imitations, which borrows anti-ecclesiastical satire of Langland himself, played an important part in bringing on the reformation of church which Langland had prophesied. But Chaucer's achievement was greatest of all. Geoffrey Chaucer lived from 1340 to 1400 and is widely considered the greatest English poet in Middle Ages. He's been also called the father of English literature. He is best known for the Canterbury Tales, which is a collection of 24 stories. Some of his major works, along with the Canterbury Tales, including the Parliament of Fowls, Troilus and Cresside, the Book of the Duchess, and the House of Fame. Geoffrey Chaucer had great influence on the new perspective which English literature after the conquest had attained. While he was entirely rooted in the soil of the Middle Ages, his art is so fully realized as to carry him out of his time and make him one of the 2 or 3 greatest poets of all time in English literature. But Middle Ages doesn't end here, we still have the 15th century. If the 15th century in England lacks great names, it is nevertheless a period in which popular literature flourished. It is a time of much activity in drama with the introduction and development of mystery and morality plays culminating in Every Man, and also the century for so many ballads and lyrical poems to be made. Thomas Malory alone enjoys a high reputation as a literary artist, with his major work Le Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur, which consists of tales about the legendary King Arthur. This masterpiece was written during Malory's imprisonment, but it didn't have to depend on the chance survival of a manuscript, for it was at the end of the century that William Caxton introduced printing by movable type to England. He published Malory's work under the name The Whole Book of King Arthur and of his Noble Knights of the Round Table, and with that, the Middle Ages in English literature comes to an end. Thank you so much for watching. To support me in creating more content, make sure you subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. Also, you can check out my Instagram page for more content. See you soon. Until then, stay safe.